Great to have you all here. We've got 20 minutes. We're going to dive into number one, what is the current state of SaaS pricing and monetization? Number two, we're going to dive into what do outliers do? So what drives outlying growth in monetization? So what you should do. And number three, a few tactics to take away that you can take back to your day jobs and work out how you make more money through your pricing and packaging. So my name's Andrew Davies. I serve Paddle as CMO. This is Ev from our pricing team. He's going to take most of the complicated content today. And as soon as they put on this microphone, he threatened to start singing. He thinks he's on Broadway. So if we get through 20 minutes without Ev singing, then we're all good. So quick bit of background. Paddle serves about 5,000 businesses globally who are product-led with their billing, their tax compliance, their payments, all around the world. And we have a metrics data set, a free product that you can lock in your own billing platform to that sees 36 billion of ARR, 34,000 software companies. So we get a really interesting, unique look into the marketplace and what drives growth. So what we're going to do today is just go under the skin of that and bring out some of these tactics and bring out some of these strategies. So if we just click through, Ev, I've introduced myself.
We're going to add the clicker. No, let's do it.
You've introduced yourself. Give us a bit of background about what you do as a day job and why people should listen to you.
Yeah, so for those that don't know me, I work on the Price Intelligently team here, which is basically 40 people that help SaaS companies with pricing and packaging. I've been doing it for about 7 years. And so what we wanted to talk about today is basically like, what are SaaS companies doing differently in 2023 versus a couple years ago? So that's kind of the point of the talk. Sarah DeVries, who's in the crowd here, ran this study. It's on about 800 companies, juxtaposed against about 35,000 companies on Paddle metrics. And so pretty interesting findings. We're not going to go through the whole thing, but there's some interesting takeaways that we want to touch on. So.
Cool. So if we just click through the next few, 35,000 subscription companies data. A really, really unique look. What has changed, though, over the last few years? Well, we've been talking about pricing, and Ev and his team have been talking about pricing for 6, 7, 8 years. And what we've really seen change is that 8 years ago, 7 years ago, 6 years ago, this was something that people just weren't putting any resource in their teams towards. There's people selling, there's people retaining customers, there's not many people thinking about packaging and pricing. And so the lift you could get with some very simple approaches was very significant. That was pricing 101. We're now in a world of pricing 201, where probably everyone in this room has heard a little bit about pricing. Someone has introduced concepts of value metrics, has introduced concepts of packaging, of do you want a freemium or a free trial and what the complications might be. And therefore, we're now in this world where most people in this room hopefully recognize that their pricing is a very strong value lever, very strong monetization lever within their business. So let's just dive into what we can do in a world of 201. How are SaaS companies pricing right now, and what should they do differently to drive outlying growth? So take it away, Ev.
Okay, the first thing that was really interesting to me, 93% of SaaS companies that we studied in the past year have made some sort of a pricing and packaging change. That's pretty intense. When I started doing this many years ago, companies were waiting multiple years to make pricing changes. We're now seeing that the volume of changes is increasing pretty substantially. Now, those changes are coming not just from price points, but also from packaging changes. So think like where features live, and also increasing or decreasing pricing. That comes down to basically 4 changes across the board. One is a price increase, which makes a ton of sense, right? We're saying like this sort of board mandate, increase profitability, and also we're sort of realizing that we have to increase prices for our products. The second is what we're calling shrinkflation. I don't know if anybody knows that concept, but like when you go to the supermarket and you order a bag of chips and the bag of chips size stays the same, but the number of chips decreases, that's shrinkflation. SaaS companies are doing that today, and it's a pretty interesting trend that we're monitoring. The third is feature introductions. So we're seeing a lot of AI and new features come into play, and that's changing how folks are packaging. The fourth is tier adjustments. Now, the highest performers within SaaS are making changes 2 to 4 times a year. This is pretty interesting also. So we're seeing that like literally just volume of changes is leading to growth. So some companies that are making changes once per quarter are seeing about 80% higher ARPA growth relative to those that are not.
So let's just stop here, okay? Because one thing I think is really interesting about what Ev's just said is it doesn't even have to be a good or successful price change for over time it compounding to your higher growth rate. It just means you've built a muscle in your business to do this. And I've been in a bunch of those boardrooms where no one wants to change pricing because it's complicated. You don't want to piss off a previous cohort of users. You don't know what sits behind the strategy. But the data is absolutely unequivocal that just doing this on a regular basis drives higher growth over time.
Yeah, agreed. the reason for this is monetization as a growth lever has a really outsized impact relative to the other growth levers. So without going too deep on this, this is called a simultaneous equations model. It's one of the reasons that we started Price Intelligently a decade ago. But it shows you if you were to isolate each lever of growth in a subscription, basically increase the effectiveness of each one by 1%, what's the yield on top line revenue? So if you increase conversion rates by 1%, you see about a 3% lift in top line revenue. Whereas if you increased monetization or ARPA or ARPU by 1%, it's like a 16% lift. So I would guess that most of the people here have sales teams, like 30 to 40% of your company is dedicated to acquisition. Most of you have CS teams. A lot of you don't have monetization teams, and this is sort of like an outsized growth lever that we should be pulling from a bit more. So you want to talk about like what we're doing today?
Yeah, I mean, let's just take a step back and think about why we're doing this. It's 2023. You've probably been hearing a bunch of talks about the state of the market. As I said, we see this really unique perspective, and we've seen declining growth rates in most sectors. There are outliers, but the new normal is a slower growth rate than we've seen when we had zero interest rates fueling cheap capital so people could buy software and you could fund your software company to go to market very, very fast. So we're moving from this phase of growth at all costs to efficient growth. And we want to make sure that we're driving other metrics other than just top-line revenue in order to see our enterprise value grow, right? So, I think this is all stuff we've heard lots over the last year, but it's really important to nail this in the concept and in the function of pricing, because pricing professionals and pricing teams who are working in all of your businesses to try and drive better monetization are probably measuring or being measured on the wrong thing. So when we surveyed hundreds of different companies, what we saw is that SaaS companies are measuring success of their pricing changes predominantly based on ACV, or average revenue per user, average revenue per account, going up. So we tweaked this, we tweaked that, we changed our packages. Did ARPA or ARPU go up? Yes or no? Now, that is just a top-line measure, right? And what's really interesting to us is there are less people looking at actual efficiency metrics like LTV to CAC, and we see NRR as really the prevalent metric for driving efficient growth. Like, seeing that in board decks is becoming more popular across the board, and yet only 5% of pricing changes and pricing strategies were being judged on NRR as a metric. So, bit of advice for here is just make sure when you're making pricing changes, you're measuring efficiency of your overall business, not just top-line growth.
Yeah, I think just real quick on that, I think when we're here next year, NRR is going to be a much higher percentage of this graph relative to something like ARR or ARPU.
Love it. It's one of those classics where, if you can measure it, then you can actually expect from it, and so measuring the right thing is important. So, why is NRR important, and what can we do to affect it? Well, two things here. Firstly, Evan's going to dive a bit deeper on what a value metric is in a moment, but maybe quickly define value metric for us.
It's the unit upon which you're charging. So it could be per user, storage, number of contacts. It's some sort of quantifiable metric that you charge folks on.
And we go deep with hundreds of companies every year on defining the perfect value metric that means that when we deliver more value, there is a willingness to pay that increases, right? You want a graph that goes like this, so as you deliver more value, the customer is willing to pay more money so you can drive up ARPU over time. But many companies are still not pricing based on that. Many companies are still just feature differentiating or pricing on other things, and therefore, what we see year over year is the delta is getting bigger between customers who use value metrics. They've understood what drives the value exchange. When you increase the value you're giving a customer, they're willing to pay more. And the delta is getting even bigger between companies that are focusing on value metrics versus not. Second point that's really important to mention here, add-ons. So again, consistently in our numbers, we see companies that start deploying add-ons can boost expansion revenue, and they correlate with a faster growth. So we can go into multi-product and other strategies as well. But when you've got more monetization levers in your package, then it really drives growth. So give us a couple of examples of an add-on that people could use.
I mean, today, we see a lot of companies with AI features that they're coming out with, and that's a prime example of an add-on. So basically with an add-on, you want less than 40% of your customers to use them. So they're going to be not very preferred across your customer base, but they will have high willingness to pay. So really effective for retention, also increasing ACVs and things like that. So yeah, AI, priority support, anything like that that's not really core to the product itself.
Premium integrations,
sure.
SSO, all of those kind of things.
Yeah.
Cool. Take it away.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about pricing philosophies and basically what the heck SaaS companies are doing or why they're making changes. without oversimplifying this too much, there's basically like three ways that SaaS companies will price. There's looking at competitors, looking at costs, and creating a value-based pricing strategy. I'm not going to lead the witness here too much. A lot of companies in PLG use a value-based approach, and this is basically broken down by go-to-market models. You can see a couple of the changes. What really jumped out to me, and a lot of us when we were running through this study, is that roughly 30% of SaaS companies are still using a cost-plus model. That basically doesn't make any sense to me, unless you're like a consumption-based SaaS company or you're an infrastructure company. Like, really no SaaS company has to look at their costs and upcharge for pricing models. So that is not how SaaS companies should be pricing. What I would take away from this is your buyers don't care about your costs, they care about value. And if you're not going out and figuring out how to quantify that value in some capacity, you're probably going to miss the mark in some regard. If you're doing okay today, then I would just think about the future, like how are you changing the product and where are you going? So the way that we think about this is we're a value-based pricing shop. Like, we go out, we run quantitative analyses, qualitative analyses, basically any sort of way that we can understand buyer behavior and figure out how to price and package from there. It takes a lot of work. There's things you can do yourself. You can also talk to people like us to help you, but it's worth it in the long run. There's no good value-based pricing strategy, for the most part, without strong packaging. So I wanted to talk also about packaging. What we're seeing, a couple of things that jumped out. Premium tier free trials are on fire. Like, this idea that you give away the product up front for free for maybe 14 or 30 days, then at the end of that payment period, you bump them down to either a different paid tier or no tier at all. You're basically calling your shot, and folks either sign up or they don't. It's a classic PLG model that a lot of companies are starting to adopt, and it's been really successful. We're also seeing that optionality is increasing. So companies that, maybe a couple years ago they had 3 tiers, classic, good, better, best. Today they have 5 or 6 or more. And it makes sense, right? Like, we're, as a SaaS ecosystem, we're maturing. We have a lot more features, more products, and more optionality correlates with that. So we're seeing more tiers is pretty common across the board. Now, in terms of the philosophies from a packaging standpoint, there's basically 2 incumbents. There's good, better, best. So you have multiple tiers, or there's all inclusive. What's interesting to me about this is that about 2% of companies are using consumption. Because we're seeing a wave of AI, I actually think this is going to go up quite a bit. So when we're here next year, I think that consumption will be like the third main bar that folks are using. Again, because you could be like an enterprise company charging a fixed per user fee for 20 years, and now you have an AI product, you can charge on consumption. Like, it totally opens up different capabilities to monetize. Last thing I'll touch on is localization. The takeaway here is, like, if you're selling to different regions, you really should be localizing your pricing in some capacity. That means updating the currency and also looking at willingness to pay. 50% of SaaS companies are not localizing today, and they're missing the mark, quite a bit. So basically what we can see is willingness to pay varies in different regions. This is a study we ran many years ago. We were looking at one core product, what's the willingness to pay in different regions relative to the US, and we found out, like, hey, folks in Southeast Asia have a 38% lower willingness to pay. Those in Western Europe have a 21% higher willingness to pay. So if you're selling the same product at the same price, like, you're just going to lose a lot of acquisition and also revenue. So it's really important that you either update your currency in local regions, but also test the true willingness to pay within those regions.
And this is super interesting, right? If we just go back a couple of slides, one more before this. So 50% of SaaS companies, and we talk to hundreds of SaaS companies every month, are simply not localizing. And so, none of the above. Not by willingness to pay, not by Forex, not by operating costs in each region, and not by tax rates. And yet every single one of those things affects what could be a price in those regions. So we genuinely see this as one of the lowest lift ways of driving better monetization. And what's also interesting is behind this, and speaking to a mostly European audience here, I am constantly gutted by the amount of non-US conferences that have got talk tracks about how to just break the US market. As if all of our success here is based on being able to open an office in New York and address that market. Because we see the data behind every single one of those nations' SaaS growth. And the US isn't growing as fast as many other areas, as Southeast Asia, as LATAM. And so, as SaaS businesses, particularly as product-led SaaS businesses, that can serve markets, growing markets all around the world, our strong advice is to make sure you have that global appeal, you've got a global focus, and then you're starting to localize by thinking about your costs in those regions, thinking about tax rates in those regions, and adding those two together, and then the next slide on willingness to pay, thinking about how much people are willing, based on their local economy, the local value propositions, the local competition, the two of those things combined is a really, really powerful unlock if you're currently charging $10 a month in every single place around the world.
Agreed.
Cool. Should we recap?
Let's do it.
Fantastic. I'm really aware that we're going through data with lots of slides here, and it's great to see a few people take photos of it, but our team are super happy to try and make this real in your context. So we do that all day long. Our booth's over there, Ev's there, Sarah's over there, we've got other people there who do this as their day job. If there's anything here that you want to now situate into your context and say, here are my plans, what would you do differently? Or let's go and do a live pricing page teardown. You might have seen, we do these regular videos tearing down people's pricing pages and their monetization strategies. Come over and let's do that live. Let's talk about your world, your customers, their willingness to pay, your pricing model, and all of this data will be sitting behind that conversation. But we'd love to make that real for you, and we're all in the same room together, so let's take that opportunity and dive deep in your context. So, number one, regular changes correlate to ARPU growth and correlate to company growth. So whatever you do, make sure there's someone at your leadership level who has the mandate once a quarter to propose, lock in, test, learn a new pricing or packaging change. Cool. Number two, Ev spoke about how premium tier free trials, so giving open access to a huge amount of your product value, and then closing that access if people aren't willing to pay after a certain period, is probably the predominant plan within PLG. So think about how you're doing that, how you can give maximum value. We're all in a world here where most of us are dealing with commercial risk, not technical risk. It's about how we distribute. The battleground is attention. The battleground is distribution. And so giving as much value as possible up front and allowing users to try it is the predominant packaging mode to do that with. And then, as Eva's pointed out, this stuff is hard. Like, how many of us are genuinely talking to customers every single day of the week to understand their willingness to pay? So we've got a whole bunch of guides around how you can do that in your market, the kind of questions you should be asking. And obviously we do that for larger SaaS companies, and we're very happy to talk about that too. But this is about asking questions on every feature. How willing are you to pay for this? What will be the cheapest price when you think it's not worth it? What's the most expensive price before you go away? And asking those questions across a bunch of axes to deeply understand how willing people are to pay. And if you can do that, then it really does set you apart from your competition. Finally, value-based pricing always wins. Find your value metric. Find the unit of exchange for your product. Don't just think about seat pricing. Don't just think about whatever your competitors are doing. This can be something that sets you apart. And we've got case study after case study of tweaking the value, of using a value metric and tweaking that, showing increased growth, increased NRR over time. Anyway, we're pretty much out of time. There's a QR code here. You can take a snap. This is our full latest research. We've just finished this. Hundreds of companies contributed. It gives you all of these baselines of what people are doing in the market. It gives you a few tools and tactics to take away. Ev, I'll give you the final moment to give any final commentary before we finish, but do come over and make this real in your own context by chatting to our team afterwards.
Yeah, shout out to Sarah for running this study. Come on over to the booth if you want to talk about it. We went through probably like 30% of this thing here, so there's a lot more that you can dive into. But yeah, I think just overall, this is a really exciting time for the SaaS ecosystem, and pricing is something that a lot of companies are starting to focus on. So I'm very optimistic about it.
Cool. Thank you so much.